Hello, welcome again to Guru Talks. I'm sure you've just seen that part, so I'll skip over it. I'm Joe Campbell, your host, and today I have an amazing guest for you, Ben Hong, um, working a contributor for Vue.js and a developer experience guy at Netlify. So perhaps we could just ask some first initial questions.
Yeah.
Hello, Ben. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to ask real quick before we start the webinar, um, because a lot of us love contributing to open source stuff. Um, and I saw that you're a Vue.js contributor, and of course, all of us really want to know how exactly did that start and how did you get into it? So we could possibly try and do the same.
Yeah. Contribution to open source can be kind of it seems kind of a nebulous thing, right? Like at the same, it's like you have this idea that everyone can contribute, but it seems like where exactly do we start? And so for myself, the way I got into it was basically I learned about Vue kind of like a few years into my career and happened to attend the first Vue conference in the United States. And it was sort of there that I started meeting some of the team and like learning about some of the different projects that they had. And at the time, there really wasn't a good way to sort of help bring people into the community, especially those who wanted to do meetups and that kind of thing. And so I simply just kind of gave a pitch to the team at the time that like, hey, I what if I create this resource that like could help bring more Vue people in, basically. And since Vue is completely open source, they're like basically like that would be interesting. Like we look forward to seeing what you do. What I've learned though is that the reason why it's tricky with open source is because a lot of people have good intentions for contributing, but most of the time they never follow through. And so what I've learned is like really contributing to an open source and getting basically onto a team. What I've learned is building that trust with maintainers that if they give you like the permissions and the ability to help, that not only will you continue the values and principles that they espouse for their community, but that eventually like you'll actually show up when they need you. Because the worst you can do is to say like, okay, I'm going to issue this PR, and then the maintainer waits for like 3 months and nothing ever happens. And so I think that's unfortunately with the scale of the internet, that's one of the most challenging things that comes with contributing to open source.
Right. Yeah, I've experienced this myself, trying to pitch in. Um,
Yeah.
and you're working as a senior developer experience engineer at Netlify.
Yeah.
How does that work? What exactly does that entail?
Yeah, so being a developer experience engineer in Netlify is really it's kind of interesting because some of you have probably heard of things like developer advocacy or developer relations, and so typically that kind of role does a lot of like talks, writes, creates blog posts and content. But one of the things we've noticed as the industry has shifted towards more developer-oriented tools is that we also needed these people to have like the experience of impacting how like the tooling actually works. So, whether it's taking prototypes that Netlify is building, and like, for example, my specialty is in Vue, so I'll take it and try to build Vue things with it, and I can give feedback to the team to impact sort of the longer tail roadmap, so that by the time it comes out, you have the ability to basically say, hey, look, we've actually tested it with popular frameworks like Next.js, or, whether it's React, Gatsby, like that's been tested before, and we've tried our best to sort of predict what sort of use cases people will use so that like you don't have to deal with as many bugs as you come out. And so developer experience, at least at Netlify, sits at an interesting role where it's sort of product engineering, but it's also content development, helps with marketing. So we kind of sit at the intersection of a lot of things and help the company to move forward.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. I love Netlify, by the way. It's really beautiful. Okay, let's. I'll slink into the background and please take it away, Ben, with your talk
All
about
right.
Vue.
Sounds good. Let's do this. All right, so I'm gonna make sure everything's good on my end. Queue up the slides. Play in window. All right, great. And then let me go ahead, share screen. Desktop one. All right. So, can people see my screen? Oh, where are the
Yes, we
chats?
can.
Okay, yes, you can. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna try to bring the chat over. I have two monitors, so in case anyone's wondering, like this is me, like making sure everything's good on this end. Perfect. Cool. Well, welcome everyone. So today we're here to talk about sort of like a high level state of Vue.js. Um, And so, as Gerald mentioned, my name is Ben Hong. You can find me under all of the things on the internet under Ben Code Zen. You saw Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. I even have a TikTok, believe it or not. I think I've camped that moniker out pretty well across the things. And so, a fun little introduction for those who don't know me. I really enjoy going to theme parks. So this is from the Orlando, Florida's River Park Adventure Universal Studios amusement park. And you see this is from the Jurassic Park River Adventure Ride, where basically you go up this like hill and you drop like 80 feet down. And it's a lot of fun. And if you can't find me, I'm the guy up here with both arms raised up, having an absolute blast. But in case you're wondering, though, this was taken way back in 2017. So don't worry, still practicing very safe distancing and those sort of things. So certainly look forward to, as the world gets a little bit more safer, for us to get back to in-person events. But yeah, that's a little fun fact for me. So I'm not going to basically skip over this slide. So as Gerald mentioned, my primary work is with Netlify and the Vue Core Team. Some of you might know my work primarily with the docs. That's where I spend most of my time. I also teach with Vue Mastery, which is a video course platform. So there we do various course topics on basically leveling up your Vue skills. And I'm also a Google developer expert in web technologies and as well as with the Map platform. So those are some of the things that I do on the side. All right, so let's get right into it, right? Like, what is Vue.js? I know that, so the audience here, from what I've heard, most of you probably already know what Vue is, and some of you may be coming from other frameworks. So don't worry, we're going to spend just a little bit of time on this. So as we know, some of the two major players when it comes to JavaScript frameworks that we know of are Angular and React. And so when it comes to React, my experience when it came to JavaScript frameworks is that Angular has the reputation of being made by Google, right? This gives it a lot of credence. And it's often sold as like the enterprise solution, right? That's kind of like its big tagline. And part of the reason for that is because it's an extremely opinionated framework, meaning like you do it the Angular way, or it's kind of really hard not to do it the Angular way. So this also means like you buy into TypeScript immediately. And anytime you try to deviate from that path is quite difficult. So while this certainly has a benefit for companies who just want like basically Google to tell them how to do things, this does lead to some inflexibility when it comes to what happens if you run into an edge case where your app is not necessarily like has some requirement that Angular doesn't support. And that's one of the tricky things about Angular. And so on the flip side, we have, can I click? There we go. On the flip side with React, I'm sure many of you have heard of, we have they're made by Facebook, and so as a result, they're arguably basically one of the most popular, if not the most popular library. The reason I say arguably the most popular is because there are a lot of stats we are missing from like the Asian hemisphere in terms of like their usage, since a lot of what we use as metrics to determine popularity is like NPM, and like firewalls in Asia and things can convolute that data a little bit. But nonetheless, it is super popular and is well beloved by the community. And one of the things that's great about React is that it has a huge community and it's incredibly flexible, right? Everything is done in JavaScript because you have JSX templates. And so basically, like, as long as you know JavaScript, you can do really like just basically anything you want with React, which has one of the reasons I really enjoyed building with it, because that's basically where a lot of my framework experience came from prior to working with Vue, is that I was in React. And so one of the things I'm grateful to the framework for is that I got really good at JavaScript really quickly, because that's actually the caveat with this, is that if you don't know JavaScript, basically, and when I say don't know JavaScript, I mean like at an in-depth level, it actually ends up becoming actually quite complicated, right? The learning curve is quite steep. So it's harder for someone to just kind of come in and contribute a little bit when it comes to React. The other benefit that I do like about React as well is that they have, because they have an actual like funding around React, they have a vision for cross-platform usage of the sort of the React syntax. So whether it's like React Native, I believe even there's a React for VR and those sort of things. There is that sort of benefit where if you're using React, you can theoretically, as long as your product requires it, start to share sort of code and learning principles across. And so that's pretty cool. But as a result, though, one of the things that I would say is a weakness of the community is that there are sort of less standards when it comes to guidelines. And so this is like basically the polar opposite of Angular, right? Which tells you exactly how to do things and what to use. React tries to be as little opinionated as possible. And so you have a lot of people who have different opinions on things like state management, how to do routing. And so this is just one of the challenges that can come with using it. And so when we think of Vue, one of the things I like to think is basically what it does is if we imagine that Angular and React had a baby, that is basically what Vue is. Because what it is it's an open source framework that has no corporate influence. Because the truth is, if we think about like React and Angular, like because particularly like React, right? It's used by Facebook, and since it's funded by Facebook, while it is certainly open source, they are basically paid to like they're solving the problems of Facebook, I would say, like primarily is like their main objective. And then certainly they are trying to listen to the community to enhance it, but like there is like some influence as far as what their priorities are. On the other hand, with Vue, because it's basically built by the community for the community, you don't have to worry about that, right? Like we are making decisions for like what is best for each individual developer. And more importantly, what we try to do is we learn from like what we saw with Angular and with React in terms of like Angular, from Angular, we want to provide some guidance along like how things could be done if you're looking for an opinion. But at the same time, we want to provide a same level of flexibility for that when it comes to like other things. So like with React, we have the flexibility. So really trying to find that midway point between the two to really give people that advantage. And so as far as like, Vue usage, this is, I think this was last month. I think Evan posted this. So we've had about, Vue has about 1.5 million weekly active users and has over 9 million NPM downloads a month. So as we can see, very actively used. And one of the projects that was recently discovered that is using Vue is actually NASA. And as we know, NASA, they're doing all this really cool stuff with space. And so for them to use Vue to help, build and basically power some of their programs is a pretty exciting thing for us to see. And so the other thing to keep in mind here too with Vue is that because as we look to strike that midpoint, really what we want to do is find ways to leverage existing knowledge that you have in order to basically get you up and running as quickly as possible. And I'll show you a bit more as we get into the essentials of it. Okay. So now we have a high level overview of that. Let's talk through like the basics, like if we were to cover Vue in like basically like 10 minutes, what would that look like? Well, the first part of any sort of app that we know about is the app instance. So what does that look like in Vue? Well, in Vue 3 here, we've just declared a constant of app. And so where's my clicker? Here we go. Okay. So we have a constant of app right here, right? And all it's doing is declaring an object because this object is basically a configuration object. We're going to pass in some options that will then define aspects of our application. And so the first thing we'll see here is that you'll see that we have this data piece right here, right? It's a function that returns an object. And so the data function here in Vue basically keeps track of all the reactive properties that you want it to basically manage for you as you go through the life of your app. So if you imagine like a counter app, for example, this is where you would have current count because then Vue will track that and then manage the dependencies accordingly. On the other hand, you'll notice that another option that I've included here is called computed. And so this would be a little bit newer for those who haven't used Vue before, in that what computed is basically a way for you to track reactive properties that have other dependencies. So here in this simple example, you'll see that we have this excited message function that goes ahead and returns the this.message, which is being referred to here inside of our data property, and then basically appending some exclamation points. So nothing terribly complicated from like a computation perspective, but you can imagine that the power of computed properties is that you start to be able to leverage like a base set of reactive properties. And as you compose them together with computed things, you basically allow you to compose some really basically complicated calculations, but in a very declarative way that people can see what it's building upon. So this is particularly useful when you're doing things such as like animations, or you're doing things with data visualizations. Having things be able to be computed makes really the developer experience really quite pleasant. And then finally here, the other piece is methods. And so all this is basically like the functions that you want Vue to manage, basically. So if we're thinking from a React perspective, these really are just JavaScript functions that we'll call typically in response to something else. So whether it's a click event or whatnot. And so you can see in this particular case for this method, what we're doing is we're referring to the message we've declared to in data, and we're saying that we're going to replace this .message to it works. And so again, we're using some simplified examples here, but here we have basically the basics of a Vue instance. All right. So Now that we've covered that, let's talk about the expressions that we use in Vue, right? This is the other piece that we need to understand. So here we have our div with an ID of app, and we have an h1 here with the message that we talked about earlier defined in here. And so you'll notice that syntactically speaking, the main thing, because what we're trying to do here is leverage what people know about HTML already. And so because of that, we needed to find a way to allow you to basically interpolate JavaScript variables inside of HTML without breaking everything. And so the way we do that is through the usage of these double curly brace, right? And so some of you might be familiar with it, and this is known as like handlebars, for example, right? So you see that here. And so by wrapping your JavaScript around it, it'll know to basically refer to what basically Vue will know, like I will replace this with the properties that have been defined. And so you can see here that because it's just normal HTML, we can then, again, write our strings and whatever we want as you normally would in HTML, and it just works as expected. And so here we've just prepended a message just to be like, this is the property that I'm printing out. But then also the other thing with message is that because it is a JavaScript expression inside of these curly braces, this means that we can actually, it looks like the transition was a little messed up. But you can see that we actually allowed to do things like actually run basically simple JavaScript inside of it. So here I've taken the message that we've defined inside of our data earlier, and now we're just saying make it all uppercase. And this would actually run exactly as you would expect. So other things that would work inside of your the handlebar expression include things like basic math calculations. So in the event you needed to like add a number or divide it by something. Or, for instance, if you wanted to do a ternary statement, which I know is pretty common in React, that is certainly something that you can do in here as well. But just know that, so this is how we do interpolation inside of Vue for basically content inside of our HTML blocks. Okay, now that we know that, we're down to basically the last part of the essentials of Vue, which is directives. This is kind of the last sort of unique piece to Vue. And so the thing is that directives in VueJS are the one piece that are a bit magical. And the reason I say this is because it is the one thing that like Vue basically helps to abstract away for you. So let me show you how that works. Here we have inside of our ID, we're back in the same scenario where we have an H1 and we are basically outputting the message. And so a common scenario though inside of our HTML, especially with single page applications, is we might only want to show this in the event that the message actually exists, because otherwise we're just printing empty tags to our basically our DOM, and there's no point in doing that. Well, if we were to do this with directives, you'll see here that we add this thing up here called vif. And what we're saying with this is actually, so the v dash is basically what tells you that Vue is using what was being referred to as directives. And so these are basically abstracted functionality that Vue, like over time, we've realized that these are things we do really commonly. And so rather than make people have to code it from scratch every single time, let's give them a way to basically drop it in their HTML in a declarative way, and then people will know what that means, and then they can just kind of go on with their lives. And Vue can be responsible for making sure that it's done in the most performant way as far as like how it's basically being like managed from a code perspective. And so in the vif scenario, right, vif will actually like remove the entire DOM element from the actual like DOM. On the other hand, for example, we also have a directive called v-show, which in that case, it'll go ahead and actually just toggle the visibility of the HTML using like an actual inline style CSS, and that's what toggles that. And so we can see here that with directives, really what we're trying to do here is give you a way to add, like basically power up your HTML without basically a lot of work. And so just to run over this once more is that we're having here with the vif, we're checking to make sure, like using normal JavaScript, like if message exists. And so the one thing that takes a little getting used to with, I realize, especially for those coming from React, is that we still have these double quotes right here. And so I know that in React, what you'd have is instead you'd have the curly brace. But there's a reason why we're not using that syntax, and I'll explain to that in a little bit. But basically, you can assume that when you have a directive here with the v dash, that everything inside of the quotation is going to be interpolated as JavaScript. So it's no longer a string, even though like you're seeing the double quotes. Okay. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and go on. So this is a tweet way back from 2017 from Sans Cone. And so it says here that 99% of software development in one requirement, which is that a user should be able to view a list of items. And certainly, while a bit cheeky at the time, the truth is, I think we all still encounter that, right? Like a lot of times, what we need to do is we need to loop through data, show it to the user.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
And my Apple Watch just went off. Okay, so let me do that again in case it interrupted with the recording. So as I was saying, let me start back a little bit. Okay, so we have this. Even though this was written way back in 2017, I think most of us can still attest to the fact that when we're creating apps, a lot of times we are simply rendering a list of data and we want to do something with those individual list items. And so, as I mentioned, like directives are meant to provide an extraction that solves 95% of use cases for basically 5% of the effort. Right? That's the whole point of, if you think about software as we move forward, is really starting to remove like the complexity of that. And so, whoop. Oh, where did that slide go? It got lost. Okay, so give me one sec, because apparently one of my slides went missing. Let me look through, let me bring this up real quick. Okay, let me kick out of the slides real quick. So when it comes to looping over an object inside of Vue, we actually have basically this directive here for v4. And so the v4 is like the v-if. Again, this is a Vue-specific syntax, but what it does is it allows you to loop through things and then go ahead and then do whatever you want with that element. And so extremely powerful, because I know that one of the challenges I had earlier on, so again, I just show you, again, this is here is an array example here. So here you'll see that this is the v4 syntax, right? You loop through an item. You can even pull out the array, because this is just, again, this is standard JavaScript, right? Item index in items. And then you can go ahead and print out the various things inside of it and manage it as you would expect. And the reason why I think abstractions like these are useful is because otherwise you end up with a bit of like, do I use the for loop to render it? Do I use the for each loop? Do I use the map? And like, I feel like as developers, we shouldn't have to keep answering that question every single time. And so abstractions like this are helpful for us, because especially for people who are newer, they want to loop through something. You know, performance can change as basically the base node of JavaScript updates. But as long as we are using it for our use cases and it's using the most performant thing, that's really all we care about. Okay, that said, we are ready to talk about basically getting started with Vue. And so we're gonna look at some live. And so as I mentioned earlier, actually, one of the things about Vue that I really liked from the get-go is that getting started with Vue is really as simple as dropping in a CDN package. And so to show you what I mean, we're going to go ahead and do this together. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal here. Let me bump up the here. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a directory called Frontmen webinar. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to kick up an index.html page. And so let's go ahead and open this up. Great. And I want to open the index.html page in the default browser. We go ahead and bring that over here to this side. All right, and then, so to show that this is working, let's go ahead and queue up an HTML5 template, and I'm just gonna say, hello, Frontmen, save, and refresh. Okay, we have a basic development environment. And so now all I need to do is I drop in the CDN package here. So let's go ahead and I have it saved right here. Right, so it's a script. All we're doing is importing the Vue Next, basically library. And right here now, all I need to do is, as long as I go ahead and declare like my app. So just like using the syntax we did before, actually I realize it's probably small for you all, so let me bump it up. Here we have our constant app, right? And so we went over the instance earlier. So we have a data property that is a function that will return. And I'm gonna, once again, I'm just gonna do the message, it works. That's all I'm gonna do. That's all this app's gonna control. And then we're gonna take view.createApp, and then we'll pass in our options, and we'll mount it to our app here. So what I need to do now is I need to actually create a div app, and then we'll go ahead and render out the message like this. And so if I save this and refresh, whoop, of course, what am I missing? Bum, bum, bum. Dangers of live coding. What did I do differently? Did I mistype something? Message. I have a typo. 3 S's. Thank you, Ali Reza. Knew that was going to happen somehow. Hello, it works. Okay. Boom. And so some of you may be thinking like, okay, why is this interesting? Well, especially earlier on, when it comes to using frameworks, I think one of the challenges that companies often have is they don't have time for you to basically stop development and restructure everything according to the latest and greatest thing. And so what Vue did really well, I think, with the CDN package early on, I think they were one of the first to do this, is it basically allows people to progressively migrate away from legacy code bases. And this, and if you're wondering, like, does this really work at scale? Am I just being theoretical? No, like GitLab, which for those of you know, like it's a fairly like enterprise product. They were on basically a big Ruby on Rails project, and that's exactly what they did. They took the Vue CDN and they would take issues to just go ahead, drop it in on certain pages and start enhancing the page over time. And eventually what they would do, they would move to the build tools. And I think this is an incredibly powerful technique that's, I think, not given enough credit for really helping to us actually move forward on legacy code bases rather than simply letting something stay old. The other thing that's really great also about the CDN method is that this means that you basically don't need jQuery anymore. You can use actually Vue as a jQuery subset, and more importantly, like because it's basically the same size, you get also a lot more like power as far as like modern JavaScript framework techniques. And so this is something that also people use for like basically like minor enhancements when they don't necessarily need like a full framework to take over their entire solution. So now that we have this, to show you just like how we would go ahead and let's say like, let's wire up the counter, like a simple counter app using this example, right? So let me look at the time. Okay, we're doing a little bit. Okay. So here we have a counter. And again, I'm doing this just because I know some of us are not as familiar with Vue. So we want to go ahead and at least show it in action, even at this level. So here, if I make the current count, let's make it current count 80, let's 88,000 right here. You see that when I refresh, our counter here is 88,000 as expected. And then what we do, if we define a methods here that says increment count, that is a function, and we say we take this.current count, and let's add at 3.14 to it every single time. That's all increment count will do. And so if we wanted to wire this up in our HTML, it's as simple as adding a button. And so now I'm going to introduce you to another directive that we have in Vue, which is basically dealing with event handlers. And so this is like our vOn directive here. So when we click on it, we're going to run our increment count method. And what we'll do is we'll say increase. And that's it. And so when I go ahead and refresh and click, you'll see that, of course, JavaScript is doing its weird float thing. But nonetheless, you'll see that it's actually increasing as you would expect. Okay, so I mentioned earlier, right, as we were taking a look at this, like, why is Vue not using like the way React does? Because again, what React would do normally, which I do like a lot because visually it's immediately recognizable, is if we use single curly brace, we could tell, right, especially because we're in JSX world, that like this is like JavaScript. Well, as some of you may be concluding at this point, part of the benefit, while we lose a little bit of that sort of developer experience of instant recognition, Vue is built to leverage what you already know and what basically exists in the ecosystem. And so rather than forcing someone to rewrite everything in JSX, you can see here that if you had an existing static HTML page that just needed a little bit of dynamic like interaction, you don't have to rewrite everything. You can simply add the CDN package to the page and then enhance it as you would expect without having to have a compiler that has to deal with those use cases. And so this is the reason why it does the double quote rather than basically the curly brace that we're used to in JSX. Okay, now that we've had that brief intro, now there are some of you who are thinking like, okay, this is nice, but like, what if I'm like building a full-blown app, right? This is not very like, this is, that's hard to work with. Well, as you would expect, just like React CLI, there's also a Vue CLI. So if we were to create a new project, for example, so I'll call it like Vue create Frontmen project. You'll see that we have, there's like basically a Webpack build option. And so we can see in here that if we go ahead and select features that the CLI allows you to do things like select whether you're using TypeScript, if you need PWA support. And so here we're talking about like router and Vuex. So for those who are new to the ecosystem, Vue has official solutions for routing and state management. But the important thing I need to say here is that while they're basically officially maintained by the team, but 100% you're more than welcome to build your own. And it's not like you need to use these things. It's just that if you're looking for an opinion and something that is going to be actively maintained by the team, Router and Vuex are basically available for you. And so if we go ahead and let's say fine, we want, let me go back. Actually, I accidentally did that wrong. Okay, I'm going to define this. So I'm going to turn on Router and Vuex. And so let's say I want to add some CSS preprocessing. I can add that. So we're going to focus on Vue 3. We can configure some things, and we can tell it, which type of preprocessor we like. And this is kind of a nice experience for those of us who are experienced with terminal. But I got something even better for you. Because Vue, while we certainly love our tooling, one of the things we try to do, again, is make things as easy as possible for people to interact with. So the Vue CLI comes built in with this Vue UI tool, which is a graphical user interface for your CLI. And so, for example, you'll see here is that we have some basically things like, I don't know about you, but a lot of times when working on development projects, I sometimes need to kill a certain port. And rather than having to basically Google Stack Overflow for what that command is, so I look up the process and stuff, here, Vue will be like, this is like a little thing where like if something is on 8080 already, it's as simple as hitting 8080 and there's nothing running, so there's nothing to kill, but little handy thing for you right there. But more importantly, let's go ahead and say we're going to create a new project. So let me go ahead and go back home. If I create a new project, you'll see that I'm actually able to use the directory to go ahead and actually create a brand new project. So again, this is like Frontmen projects. We can select the default package manager. So I'll pick Yarn in my case. And then here we can see like the manual bit. And you can see that now we actually have a way to really for those of us who aren't as comfortable with it, we can still pick exactly what we want and configure it. But what's really nice is then like everything is as simple as like if I do something wrong, I can go back and replace it. Whereas with the CLIs, you saw I had to cancel it. So here we can pick 3x, we can pick the configuration we want, we can pick the unit testing we want, and this is really great. And so I'm not going to go through the process of making you wait for the Yarn install. But what's really cool about this, let me clear this, is let me go ahead and import my V3 lab. Is that one, it actually gives you also a much more visual insight into your app. So you can see here, this is basically package.json, but more importantly, you can actually see all the various plugins here. It's easy to tell the version, whether it's an official one. And if you want more information on the docs, it's as simple as clicking on a link. More importantly, if you want to add things, so if we want to add Vuex, you'll see I can actually look for different plugins to add. So here, this allows me, rather than npm install -d, this allows me to basically look at the ecosystem of things that are supported for Vue CLI. And so if I wanted to use like a material framework like Vue CLI, like Vuetify, you can see that I can actually get that and then actually manage it all here from the interface. And then on top of that, Vue UI is also designed to do things like make configuration really easy, so that rather than having to memorize how things are supposed to be like syntax-wise, here you can see that, for example, how you actually determine where the distributed folder is going to be built. Rather than dist, maybe you want build. And then maybe the public path should be something else. But this surfaces things in a way that's intuitive and doesn't force people to memorize those things. And this is particularly true of things like ESLint configuration, right? I don't know about you, but I can't memorize how to define whether or not an error is partially right, partially there. But Vue UI, again, in the pursuit of making things as easy as possible for our developers, here you can see that you can actually turn things on. I want it to be an error. I want it to be a warning. And then can you imagine, like, this just makes life much, much easier. Now, I won't get into too much more than that. But what I also want to show, though, is that if I go ahead and run the development server here, let me go ahead and start running this. You'll see that it'll basically do what we're used to inside of our terminal, which is npm run dev. And then with that, what we get once this thing spins up, let's see, this is Vue 3 Playground. It's a little slow. Output processing. Oh, it is there. Oh, is it because it's the Vue 3? Okay. Well, so what you'll end up seeing here actually is basically you can analyze the app. I don't know what's going on right now, but again, I won't want to waste your time. But what you do get is a basically graphical representation of your assets being broken down in a data visualization way. So I'm sorry this doesn't work right now. Normally it's a fun piece to show people. But again, it's this sort of level of tooling that the Vue community really tries to bring up. And as far as contribution goes, it's things we're always looking for new ideas, right? In order to better enhance and make our lives easier. But that said, let's go ahead and I'm going to start up. Oh, something configured. I think I did something weird there. But okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up my Vue. This is my own sort of sandbox for the Vue CLI. And so let me show you basically what we see here. What we have is basically your standard front-end directory structure where you have basically your source directory, which contains everything as far as like the different components that you have. And then you also have a public directory for things that'll be served directly in your dist folder. And that's basically like, and then your usual configuration files. Like that's what you get for using like the Vue CLI, is provide that scaffold for you. But let me go ahead and run this locally for you so we can actually see what the development experience like is for Vue. And so just like you would expect from something like the React CLI, we have basically, let me go ahead and bump this over, bump this 2/3, and let me go ahead and hide the terminal. And let's start with main.js. The main.js here is basically something that's scaffolded, and this is where you'll actually see this syntax that we used earlier in the CDN. This is something you'll basically never touch, because what it's saying is that, hey, take your public.html and mount our app to it. And so most of the time we don't really come in and muck around with main.js. But if you're wondering where it starts right here. And so here right now, we'll see that if we go inside of my app.vue, right now I have a bunch of stuff in here, so I'm going to wipe it. One of the new things about Vue, especially for those coming from React, is the idea of single file components. And so what's really nice about it is it means that you can encapsulate your logic, your template, and your styles in basically one place. And so here, once again, let's go ahead and quickly define, I'm going to go ahead and define the counter app again. So I'm just going to using the ES6 syntax for functions. And we have current count. Once again, I'll just do 8800. And then we'll have our methods of basically increment count. This time I will avoid though this current count plus equals, let's say 1200. And then inside of our template here, which is our HTML, then we can do things like h1 counter p current count is current count. And then we can do the button here, which is where we add click increment count. All right. And so some of you might be wondering immediately, like, what is, thank you. Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. And so you can see everything refreshed. And thanks, Xander, for noticing that. Okay, so one of the new things you'll probably notice is that, let me bump this up a little bit, is that here, I guess I can use my clicker here. We notice that there's this little syntax of the @ Basically, we realized that you're going to be using v-on a lot. So rather than making you type v-on every time, we just gave it an alias of the @ symbol. So that's what that means. And so when we click, everything updates as expected. The beauty of this now is you're wondering, like, what, okay, this is nice. And then what about styles, for example? Well, we can actually style things. So if I did like a dot button, for example, and let's give it a background color of, let's say like green and color of white, for example. Okay, and then if here, again, everything inside, actually, I don't think I mentioned this before, everything inside of the template block is standard HTML. So what this means is also like future migration actually is quite a lot easier, because this means that like if for whatever reason, like, it's, as we know, technology changes, you're switching from Vue to something else, your HTML still remains the same. Whereas like I think when we get to the lower levels, that not necessarily the same can be said if you're forced to like do some compromises along like class name and those sort of things. And so that's one of the things I like about it, is that people who don't have any JavaScript experience can walk in and make modifications without understanding the caveats of the framework. Again, leveraging what we already know. And so here you might be thinking like, okay, that's kind of interesting, but then this means that this CSS, like, won't that pollute other components? Well, it certainly can, but this is why we allow you to basically add attributes inside of your single file components to make it even easier to use. So those of us might be familiar with scope styles, for example. So let me go ahead and actually, before I save, I'll show you the difference. Here, when we're using our styles here, you'll see that it has a standard class of button. Whereas when we go ahead and save this and it refreshes, you'll see that while it does still have the same class as button, what it does is it actually now appends a unique data attribute to the element right here that you see the data-v. And then inside of the actual compiled CSS, you'll see that it's actually appends it to the CSS class so that you have a little bit more scoping in terms of your CSS and protecting it. Now, some of you, of course, who have experience with CSS will go, well, this doesn't really protect me from everything because what about specificity? Well, basically a popular methodology that's been popular with Vue going forward, not Vue actually, sorry, the front end world is CSS modules. And believe it or not, CSS module is as simple as swiping in the, basically instead of scoped, you'll tag it module. And then because what you're telling it is that we're going to use some JavaScript to basically do some runtime compilation for us, we're going to go ahead and swap this from the class to something that's going to be managed by JavaScript at the build time. And so this is where I'll introduce you to the directive vbind. And so v-bind, what it does is it says that there's this HTML property that I want you to pay attention to. And in this case, it's class. And what I want you to do in this is I want you to go ahead and then run a JavaScript expression that will then result into things. So this is our way of making it dynamic. And so rather than button now, for example, this is going to be style.button. I know this is going to take some getting used to, but I think you're going to see why this is very, very cool. It's because you'll notice here that when it's actually outputted to the CLI with no additional configuration, I haven't done any magic here, that the class name actually has been renamed to app-button-bncwo. And so for those who are new to CSS modules, the reason this is powerful is because one, at the very end, we have basically a unique hash to differentiate it from other things. We also see the original CSS class. And this is one of the things that my biggest complaints when people do CSS modules without keeping the original name is that when it comes to debugging, it's like you have such a hard time figuring out where it came from, right? It should be as simple as this, which is telling you actually, so if you're wondering where app is coming from, remember that we're in app.vue. So now the CSS class is great because if something's broken, it is going to be broken specifically with this element within the file of app.vue with the CSS class of button, and then you can go from there. And then work is so much easier. And this is one of the strategies I love. And again, this is not Vue specific. I would love all the frameworks and all CSS modules to basically adopt this convention, because we all know that while you might save a couple bytes removing those things, one of the things we need when something goes wrong is the ability to identify a problem. And there's nothing like trying to wade through a ton of CSS files trying to figure out where certain properties live. That's not really helping us, is it? But okay, I'll get off my soapbox for CSS modules. But it's a super nice thing. And then so for those of us who are wondering oh gosh, am I gonna pollute my HTML with vbind? Don't worry, we also realize that this is probably something that you're gonna be doing a lot. So we actually allow you to just simply prepend it with the colon. And so whenever you see an attribute being prepended with HTML, in our HTML attribute, this does the same exact thing. And again, your code is clean, but it's very clear to you that you're doing something different with this HTML attribute. Okay, so what I want to jump into next, I think we have a little bit of time left before we get into Q&A, is that I know, so for those who have been following the Vue 3 ecosystem, you're probably thinking, especially those coming from, I think, the React world, this thing here, right, where we see the data and the methods, this is known basically as the options API, because what are we doing? We're passing the application options of things to do. And while it has its benefits, it certainly has its downsides as components begin to scale, because you have basically features that are split up between multiple options. And so for those of us who call it a little more freedom of defining how things are, I'm going to take this a little bit of a step forward into the new composition API that's come with Vue 3. And basically show you how that works. And I think this might actually, I think this is going to be a turning point for a lot of people, because it'll show you kind of the simplicity, the elegance of this. So what we're going to do is a couple of things as we leverage this is one, let's go ahead and start by switching out what we have with the counter to use the composition API. And the way we do this is we actually call a setup method inside of our component. And this basically says at the beginning of our component, do all of these things, and then then Vue will take care of it from there. And what's nice about the setup function here is that basically once you get into setup, everything here is vanilla JavaScript. Because as you notice here, even when we're in things like the methods for increment count, you'll notice that this .current count, this is still using a little bit of magic, because as we know, one of the hardest questions to answer in JavaScript is like, what is this? And so in sort of the option API form, Vue tries to give you some syntactic sugar by always assuming that this contains like the Vue instance, and that's why it knows that this .current count refers to basically this .data .current count. But again, some people are not as big of a fan of the magic of this, and so what if they wanted something a little bit more a level of control? Well, the way we do this is we would say, I'm going to go ahead and say const current count. Actually, I'm going to do new current count so I don't conflict. And this one, I'm going to make this 1200, right? And I'm going to return this out into new current count. And so in the simplest form, what you'll see here is that we have a constant new current count, which is equal to this integer 1200, and it's being returned to the component. This is like the one thing that's different in terms of like managing things. And so now if I go ahead and print this out inside of our template, I'll say new current count. We'll see here, we see 1200. But for those of us who are more familiar with JavaScript, we know that this variable is static. There's nothing, we can't modify this. So if right now we wanted to declare a method, right, called new increment count, where we want to go ahead and like thinking back to the options model, if you're like new current count plus equals, let's say 3600, this is not going to work, because after all, it's a constant. This is vanilla JavaScript now. So of course, if we want reactivity, we need to introduce helper methods to basically like what we're doing. And so what we do is we need to import from Vue, we need to import, I'm going to show you all reactive, basically the reactive helper method. And what it does is it says like, hey, I want to create reactive data. So rather than do it like this, I'm going to create a const of state that is a reactive object. And so if I move this new current count in here, like this, then we can replace new current count with state.newCurrentCount. And then I can expose this method, new increment current count, to the component. You'll see now that, whoops, what's going on? Oh, right, this doesn't exist. Sorry. So actually, let me explain. So the reason it's angry is because I'm exposing new current count, but this is a property of state. So let me expose state instead. And so now in here, I can replace new current count with state.newCurrentCount. And then instead of the button for increment count, I'm going to do new increment count. And what we'll see here now is that when I click, you'll see that it's updating as you would expect. And this is kind of one of the elegant pieces, I think, of the composition API here, is that you really start to get into composability in a way that has a lot more freedom. And so, you know, I think we're gonna start to see some really interesting patterns as a result. And again, this is super, I mean, like, I don't know, let me qualify that. I think one of the nice things about this now is that rather than forcing people to learn the options API in this case, people who might come from stronger JavaScript backgrounds, if they're using Vue 3, can also go straight into the composition API if that's what they prefer to use. And I think this highlights back to what I think is particularly elegant about Vue's approach to this, is that it's trying to let you choose what's best for you and your team. And I think that's really important to think about, is because also, like, if you're wondering, like, how does TypeScript work? You basically add like lang ts, and then like the compiler will know what to do with it, and then you can do TypeScript stuff in here. And so, you know, as Vue 3, like, the ecosystem begins to mature, it's really this question of like, how can we make it easier for people to leverage what their team does best, and then equip them to move forward in like a really powerful way. And so as you can see with the composition API here, it gives you an alternate way to define things. But for those wondering, like, oh, does this mean like composition is the best thing and I should like do everything in that? Like, not necessarily. Because one of the beautiful things about the options API, as we know, as you might have be able to tell from this, let me just cut this out so we can have this all on one screen, is that it's very declarative as far as what goes where. And you don't like, while you can say that this is confusing, for someone who's new to JavaScript, they actually, if you just tell them that this refers to anything inside of the Vue instance, they can follow. And I've taught Vue quite a number of times prior to Vue 3. And I think one of the best examples of this was when I taught a designer who hadn't been coding for years. And she actually almost didn't come to the workshop because she was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to follow this. But as long as you have basic JavaScript like understanding, like within an hour, she was up and running, because here people can tell that like, okay, there is data. I know what data is. And this is like current count. And I increment count. Great. I'm trying to like change it. And then, oh yeah, it's being printed here in my HTML. And then again, this would be incorrect, but like, oh, this button is calling this method. And I think that's what's really beautiful, is that this empowers your team members, regardless of JavaScript ability, to come in and contribute and make a real impact without feeling like they have to learn basically like this brand new thing that they have to step into. And of course, like, you know, I won't go into like the know-how of this, but also know that like for my like React developers, that like you don't have to use template. This is here because most of us prefer using native HTML, but Vue has render functions too. So if you want to use JSX, right, because a common example that's talked about with render functions, that's actually a great use case, right? Because no solution in coding is perfect. There's always compromises you're making in trade-offs for those things. So you'll see that, for example, like in the event of like a dynamic heading where you don't know if it's going to be, let's say, an H1, H2, H3, H4, it would probably be kind of repetitive to make a template that's like v if 1, H1, v if 2, H2, v if 3, else if, etc., etc. And so here you'll see that Vue actually, like, so you can see the example here, right? If level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like that's a lot, and that's really repetitive. That's not, we want to find ways to be more efficient. And don't worry, that's why, this is what I was saying as far as like escape hatches. Vue right here, we have a render function that again takes in, and there are JSX plugins to make sure that you can just return the JSX and it'll do its thing. And so that's what I really can't stress enough, is that I think a lot of people who like learned about Vue at the beginning probably had a lot of misunderstandings regarding what it was capable of and what it does. And the truth is that what it's really trying to do is give people the ability to do like really, like get them up and running as quickly as possible. While also the moment you're like, oh, I need something else, the escape hatch is there for you. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about Vue. And so to quote Sarah Drasner, she had this thing that she said in one of her courses where she's like, one of the things I love about Vue is that it gives me what I want and then it gets out of my way. And so that's what I think is also really great. I found in my own learning experience with Vue is that you really only need to learn whatever is relevant to you at the time. Whereas like, especially like even with like Angular, for example, right? I talk a lot about React. Like if you don't know TypeScript, you basically cannot do a lot with Angular. You can probably do next to nothing. But with Vue, do I have the other one open? I do right here, right? As long as someone has basic, like, or even they can HTML, CSS skills and understands like basic JavaScript syntax from like, this is an object, this is a function, like basic types, they can get up and running. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And so Ararat actually brings up something, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Vue is also looking to make things easier too, because for those of us thinking like, like this is a lot of boilerplate, right? If I go ahead and swap this out, like every time I need to set up like this export default object, Vue is always looking to improve the developer experience. And so this is sort of, I believe this is inspired from, actually I don't recall where it was inspired from, but something that's being worked on right now as an experimentation is adding this attribute to, whoa, what just happened? Okay, here we go. The setup attribute to script. And what this does is it actually tells Vue that like, hey, all that option boilerplate that you normally use, don't worry, like we're gonna assume everything in here is inside of a setup function, and then we're gonna do our thing. It says felt, yeah. And so knowing that, yeah, so let's go ahead and switch gears for a second back. So I've talked about that, and okay, I know I want to give time for actual proper Q&A. So believe it or not, those are the basics of Vue. So within the hour, we've gone through and talked about really how Vue apps work at a high level. There's certainly a lot more inside of it in terms of things that we can do. Just like other single page applications, we have lifecycle hooks. There are even animation helpers and all sorts of things that you'll get into. But I want you to know, like, this is all that's needed to really get started with Vue, and you can kind of basically go from there. Now, the thing I want to talk about at the end here regarding contributing, right? Because as we know, one of the themes with this is about giving back to open source and finding ways to get into it. And so Vue has a lot of angles in here because we are fully open source, a lot of ways to get into it. So when it comes to build tools, one of the things that was mentioned in the chat, so we have, certainly Webpack, so you could contribute to Vue CLI and improving the development tools there. But for those who don't know, one of the things that's been sort of coming up a lot inside of the front end world is ES builders. And so I had to give a fair shout out to Snowpack, who's also like helping to push the sort of the waves on this. But Vite, for example, is a project that Evan basically started. And one of the things I love about this is that it's starting to bring the community a bit together. I don't know about y'all, but I'm really tired of framework wars and like who's doing better. Like, I just want everyone to learn from each other, and then if we can just pick and like figure out what makes something great and then reuse it and then just keep going, like we're gonna make the web a better place. I think that's what we're all here for. And so Vite, and so again, I think a lot of you will think it's pronounced Vite, understandably so, but it's French, so it's Vite. And what it does is it takes the new sort of ES module, native ES module support in browsers, and makes the startup time basically like a lot faster. Like, I think Sunil Pai, who's worked, I think, on the React team before, he was saying that like, I think they were having build times of like 2 minutes, I want to say at one point. And then with this new sort of approach with like Vite and ES build, I think it came down to like seconds, right? And so this is a very exciting space that is just getting started. So if you're talking about open source, like, this is the time to get into, for example, like this project, because Vite is very new. I know that Evan just recently started looking for contributors to like help maintain issues and those sort of things. And so if you're looking to get started with something that's like, earlier in its development, Vite is a fantastic thing. And so just to show how fast it is, like right now, if I went ahead and built the app that we have, you'll see that like we're used to things, even though it's not as slow as it used to be, we're still used to things taking a little while. And so again, I'm not gonna make you run through this whole thing, but like here you can see that took 11.5 seconds. But in the event we're using like a Vite app, for example, this is not a total one-to-one. So this part of this is just for illustration purposes. You'll see that it'll go ahead and run through, and this was done in 3.42 seconds. Like again, the code bundle is not totally the same, but it is drastically faster. And so if we're talking about development too, you can see that like this thing started within 434 milliseconds. So I'm not going to get into performance and all these things, but just know that like this whole realm of ES build, it is like I would say if I were to make any prediction, I usually don't like making them. ES build is going to make a very big impact on how we work as developers. So while it's not directly related to Vue, this is tangential. And I'd love to see the community come together on this, because again, if you're wondering about like, oh, well, does it have React support? So if I do yarn create Vite app, VueJS app, I believe it's it. So it's gonna fetch it real quick, and then I'll show you real quick. You'll see that, Okay, I'll wait a second. Come on. Oh no, test, please. Nope, it's not gonna let me do it. Okay, that's fine. What I was basically trying to illustrate is that Vite is not a Vue thing. And so you'll see basically that as far as scaffolding your first Vite project, there's already support for like, I don't know if it's lit or light. I'm gonna call it light. Light element, Preact, React with TypeScript. It's already there for you to start playing with. So regardless of your framework, I'm excited to see what people do with this space. And yeah, so finally, I think I have a couple minutes left before we need to get into Q&A. So we talked about build tools. We talked about the authoring experience. IDE support, like any good framework, It's also important to make sure that auto completion and easy refactoring becomes a thing as well. So if you're looking to get involved with those projects as well, there are a bunch involved there. Again, I won't put the whole list here because it'd be hard to memorize. And as well, I mentioned that we have different projects within the Vue community, right? And so we have switch over. So I'd mention, for example, that we have a bunch of official projects. So if you're looking at the Vue CLI, for example, let's see, let me just go to github.com, VueJS. I think that's it, actually. Here is where you can actually find all of the various projects that are officially supported by the team. There's a lot of different repositories, but you'll see that Vue Router is one of them, Vuex. And so while certainly I know that one of the challenges of contributing to open source is that when something is very established, it can be really hard to break through the noise, right? Because everyone's trying to get the maintainer's attention. And it can be frustrating when you have a PR that solves a problem and you're like, why isn't this getting merged in? I can assure you that the team is working as hard as they can to be responsive. To give you some context, actually, when I say the team is open source, so the Vue team actually, I think there's only 3 of us that actually live in the United States. And after that, we're actually spread out. I think we have about 20 team members throughout the entire world. Group primarily, I think Europe and Asia are the 2 biggest hotspots. And what's particularly interesting too is that what people don't realize is basically we're all volunteers. I think maybe there's 2 or 3 people who are actually working on this full time. And for that reason, I think hopefully that gives a little bit more context in that while people who are creating these products and maintaining them, they are doing it in their free time. So please be a little bit more considerate when realizing that issues may not be moving as quickly as you want. But more importantly, I think when it comes to adding changes, contributing to open source, the big thing to remember is try to show that you're going to consistently show up and you're going to be there to help out. Because also, again, because remember, when you issue a PR, the maintainer has to make sure it doesn't break everything else. Because while you might be 100% sure it fixes your issue, there's still other things to consider, right? And so that's, I think, what makes it challenging for maintainers. And over time, I'd love to see more people contributing to the ecosystem. So we have all those projects that are dealt with. The other thing I do want to talk about, for those of us who are really into the architecture of things, you're definitely going to want to bookmark this, which I'm going to drop in the chat, which is the RFCs. So they say requests for, I think it's requests for changes. I constantly say requests for changes. Requests for comments, darn. Basically, these are when you have major APIs that worth either, or not even major, just new features. So let me just show you an example. Here, one of the new things that I'm really excited about is variables. Oh, is it not here? Okay, whatever. Let's go ahead and, these are older pending RFC list. This is what I want. Okay, here we go. I was right. Okay. Here, let me show you this. So this is exciting because one of the challenges with CSS in JS is that we're used to injecting CSS variables into JavaScript. But with Vue, they're basically proposing a way for you to actually inject variables from the JavaScript into the CSS, but still leveraging CSS. That's what I think is the most beautiful piece about this. And so as you can see here right now, this is really just a proposal. This is talking about API design. And so if you're interested in getting involved with this, this is the place to do it. You can comment on the thread, try to propose other scenario examples, and I've seen some very active discussions in this space. So just know that for those who love this kind of thing, who might not necessarily want to contribute from that regard, this is available for you. All right, I'm a little over time, so I'm going to end. Community. Community is a really big part. With the VueJS, we have a code of conduct, and we do enforce it when we have people who have violated and basically the terms and the condition. Again, it's quite simple, really. But what I'm trying to say here is that community is a big part of Vue. We try to make it a safe and welcoming place for everyone who comes into it. And so, if this is something you want to be a part of, we have a lot of meetup organizers and those sort of things who are always looking to just continually add to the warmth and the welcoming aspect that we try to maintain with the Vue community. So that is totally another aspect to contribute, which is just as important, to be honest, when it comes to everything else. Because we know that with open source, when the community begins to deteriorate, then that's when basically people start to look for greener pastures. All right. Finally, last wrap up things that I want to mention is in case you're looking for new things to learn about, I have to give a plug to this course platform that we built at Netlify with my team called Jamstack Explorers. It's built with Next.js, in case anyone's wondering. And it's open source so people can kind of see how we did it. But the reason it's interesting is because there is a free launching with composition API course on there that I've done. And so for those who actually want to dive into composition API and get a better sense of its fundamentals and what's behind it, all that's here. It's a video course, 100% free. So just know that that's there for you. And of course, I got to give one final shout out to Vue Mastery, who I work closely with, at creating really quality content courses and helping to really bring learning concepts to life. And so if you're looking for a place to learn about video stuff, check that out. And I forgot to include a screenshot in this, but for those more senior and like people who are looking for more like senior enterprise patterns, call it, with VueJS, there actually is a production grade VueJS course on Vue Mastery that I did recently. And so that'll go through some of more sort of like the opinionated things to like talk about different practices. And again, I say best practices because best practices, while I say that in here, I think a lot of times gets people to only like, they think like this is the one thing I should do. And you know, for those who are going to watch this course, or for those of us as we develop in our career, I think it's critical to remember that anything we learn about always has caveats. It might not be immediately apparent, but what might work well in 99% of the scenarios, I guarantee you there's a 1% where it doesn't really make sense to do it that way. And so I think if we can approach our discussions going forward with this sort of mindset, I think we're going to see a much richer discussion of ideas, and hopefully like we can really all move the web forward together. And so with that, here's my, at least, thank you slide before the Q&A. So once again, you can find me on all the things at BenCodeZen. And there's my GitHub, Twitter, YouTube. In case you're looking for content, I do try to do some live streaming on Twitch as well. So with that said, I think, Gerald, we should open it up to Q&A.
Yes, let's. Thank you very much, Ben, for that wonderful talk and of basics of Vue.js. Very good for Vue noobs like me. So thank you very much. Yeah, let's get stuck in with these questions. So either Italio or Jan is asking this question. They're using the same account, so I don't know who's who. But how would you go about building a highly complex component such as a visualization graph, where you need to deal with the logic before the component is mounted, after it is mounted, and also after it's unmounted?
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just for some pseudo coding, because I think that'll be the easiest part for us to talk about this. So let's go ahead, bump this out a little bit. I'm going to just, again, we're going to make some assumptions here. So inside of the script, let's go ahead. So basically the problem that we have here is that when it's mounted, we're just going to do a fetch call to, again, I'm just going to say like api.com/data, right? And then we want to go ahead, and again, we're just going to assume that the response is going to be, we're going to take the response.json, and then we're going to go ahead, and then finally, after it's been transformed, we'll take the data in here, and then let's assume, again, we're making a lot of assumptions here, that viz data, again, I'm just going to make it an empty object. This.viz_data equals here. Okay, so this is our basic setup here. And so when it comes to composing things in Vue, it's really based on what makes the most sense. So if you're saying that like when it's unmounted, we actually have to like destroy things or whatever, then certainly we have our lifecycle hooks for like unmounted. So that would then, for example, we could say this.viz_data equals, like just basically reset it. Whoops, and this is actually wrong. This would be data. But okay, let's go ahead and just do a little bit more pseudocode because you're talking about handling data visualizations. So let's assume in here we have a couple of things, like we have a list of like, let's say coordinates, right? And we're gonna go ahead and assume it is as simple as this list of numbers, for example. There'll be times when you're transforming things, right? That you have users choose the preference. And so maybe the user preference is like they wanna see certain visualizations at scale. So if we envision that like each number represents how big a circle is, let's say for example, because we're using like D3, then what you want to do is you might want to say like user preference, and we'll call it like, for now, I'll just say like 1x. And so if we think about 1x, we're talking about how big the data visualization might be. And so this is where I love the question, is because we get to show the power of computed properties, in that what we can do now is we can say, hey, we want to actually determine like how big the display size is. So what I can do is I can do a display size, and I can return this dot coordinates dot map. And for every item in here, I'll return item times this dot user preference. And I think hopefully some of you are actually starting to realize like the elegance of this, because what this means now is that in the UI, as long as I control user preference to whatever the user wants, 2, 300, 500, 600, and then as long as you're rendering this display size, like it works. You're done. Like that you've now like all that logic that you might have had to watch, like you have these two base properties, and then computer says like, hey, please computer, do the math for me, like take care of the rest. And that's all. And so if you're looking for examples, I would check out Sarah Drasner's CodePens. She does wonderful things, like as far as computing things. So like, let me make sure. CodePen Estraz. I think it's Estraz, or yeah. So here's a really popular one she did here, where you can see that like based on the local time, let me blow this up a little bit more. I can't blow it up. That's fine. But you see that like if I choose different time zones, it'll update the animation in the back to like the appropriate thing, and I can be like Berlin, and then it'll go ahead and say it's evening, or gosh, how is it in Hong Kong right now? Definitely very late. And so I'll drop this example here. I believe this is using Vue 2, but the learning concepts are the conceptually they're all there. And so yeah, hopefully that was a quick down and dirty like how data visualization works with Vue. So let me know if you have. Feel free to add some more detailed things.
I'm sure they will. Thank you. Yes, next question from Jordan. How do you find the balance between maintaining a familiar, albeit old syntax, but also innovating as much as you can? React seems to have abandoned familiarity almost entirely early on with JSX, for example.
Yeah, the balance with, so yeah, if I understand the question correctly, we're talking about like taking what people already know and how we innovate on it. And this is a really challenging thing, because as we know with a lot of things, when we're new to things, we're kind of really open-minded with how things might work, right? When you first learn programming, you really didn't have an idea of how things should work. But once you had like the one programming language under your belt, unfortunately, we start to see everything else through that particular lens. And that's, I think, a challenge that all frameworks deal with to some extent. One of the reasons you'll notice that Vue really tries to approach things from a progressive manner, right? From the sense, as I said, like you don't need TypeScript to get started, but like you can graduate to it and other things like that. And just like render function, you don't need to start there. You can start with templates and then go to render functions. It's because one of the original core team members, Chris Fritz, actually was an educator basically in his past career. And actually there are other core team members who actually like myself who have spent a lot of time teaching. And because of that, I think there is a natural empathy for people coming into the space, because like I don't have a computer science degree, and I taught, I learned basically all the programming stuff prior to boot camps and stuff. So I know just how frustrating it can be to walk into something where you have limited like knowledge and support, and how to basically move those things forward, which is one of the reasons why we pride ourselves in our docs and always looking for ways to improve it, because we want people, regardless of their economic circumstance, to still have the ability to like actually be really effective with their technologies. So hopefully that was a kind of a long-winded answer, but basically like RFCs are our way of basically starting to introduce ideas to the community. So the script setup syntax, for example, is going to be one of those things that feels a little weird for Vue developers who are used to like that export default syntax. And for example, for those who have looked at Svelte, I guess let me share my screen for this too, because otherwise people are not going to know what the heck I'm talking about.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the new things Svelte introduced, which again, people were like, oh, this looks weird. Yes, give me an example. Let A be set change. They had a different syntax. I just realized. Let me do the ref sugar here. This might be better. Ref sugar. Yes. Here we go. I believe this was inspired from Svelte here, but here's an example of the Vue team trying to like propose something new. And you'll see that inside of this script setup block, rather than having you import ref as a helper method and then like from Vue like you would normally expect, you'll see that it just introduces brand new syntax. So there's not even a const, there's not even a let. It's literally just ref colon count, and then you can just like use it like normally. But for some people, this is really weird because they're gonna be like, this is not JavaScript. This is heresy. This is bad. And I think I hope that as a community we can try to stop being like this a bit, because just like jQuery brought so much to what we've learned and what made like a lot of things that were jQuery became built into the browser and built into JavaScript. Like it's perhaps like through these experimentations that we learn how to like move ourselves forward. And so finally the TLDR, the answer to your question, is that when you're introducing new concepts, to try and really consider the backwards compatibility, that don't just strip away what people are available to them. Just like the options and composition API, this is going to be a hot topic of debate, I believe, for the next couple of years. Is that some people will be very like, do everything in composition API, and then some people will be like, but I like my options API. And finding that middle balance of like, for those who don't need the composition API, they don't have to use it. Vice versa, for those who like the options, they can still stick with it. It's a bit tricky to maintain, but I think when it comes to moving a community forward because let's face it, right? For those of us who spend a lot of time in this, we're like, oh gosh, we've like moved past this, we've learned this. But like most people have limited experience and they're not like spending all their time thinking about this. And so that's part of the challenge sometimes with the way we do things. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, that's great. I think Vue is very accessible to programmers and non-programmers. A question here from Jan or Talo again. Is there any strong movement in the community regarding JSX with Vue? At Storybook, we are looking into the best practices to present users with a good boilerplate with component examples when installing it.
Yeah, VueJS is definitely supported because I want to say this is the repo. I'm just going to drop it and then I'm going to share screen. Sure. So just know that because underneath like the template, for example, it is like actually turning it into like JSX and doing all the shadow DOM performant things for us. So just know that like JSX is top of mind. And so check out that repo if you'd like to follow more progress on that project. But yeah, it's super important to us.
All right. Thanks, Jan, for the question. From Jurge, we have another question. Maybe a bit of a deep dive, but I'm trying out Swerve, stale while revalidate for Vue, and it leverages the composition API's ref for data fetching. But it looks like it is violating the ref v's reactive use cases. Could you explain the actual difference between ref and reactive and why the former is only for primitives? FYI, I'm using composition API in a Vue 2 project.
That is super helpful. Okay, so ref versus reactive. Let's go ahead and share screen again, because this is one of those things that I think we benefit. So Netlify blog, and the reason why I'm coming here is because, funny you should ask that question. I wrote a post like that got published last week around this topic. This isn't totally the answer, but I want to drop it for people's reference. And also there's code examples here we're going to use real quick to do some. Okay, so for those who saw watching me live code earlier, we had the concept of reactive where we had a reactive object. And so ref is actually the base. Again, ref, think of reference. It's sort of the base way of making things into reactive things. And so you can see here that I have a const of first name, and I'm saying that turn this string of Ben into a reactive ref. That's the way to think about this. And so the question here is around the idea of primitives and why it uses ref. So I haven't used Swerve myself, but one of my opinions with this piece you'll see here is that the thing about ref, and let me go down because I think it's worth people covering this for people, is that ref has some sort of things you need to learn about it because it's utilizing JavaScript proxies underneath. And so you'll notice that when you want to access the ref, right, first name, you have to do this thing called .value, which basically unwraps the reactive proxy and then gets you what you're actually looking for. And while this is how it works underneath, the reason I don't like this is because this is not how most people are thinking about their JavaScript, right? The way we're naturally used to working is just like first name and then last name, and that's what we do. And so, and it's kind of a gotcha. And so in this case, I talk about how it's used in like, for example, I remember when I said you had to unpack by dot value. You'll see here that hero name taco launcher. When you're calling it inside of the template, like once you've exposed it to the actual JSX side, you actually don't need to unpack it yourself, right? Like dot value, Vue will take care of it for you in that case. But the reason why you might be like, well, why didn't we standardize this inside of the setup method? That's because it is just JavaScript in here, right? So Vue can only help you whenever you tell it to. We can't like automatically get in there and do things like assume things for you. And so for that reason, that's why when you're in setup, you have to unpackage it whenever you want to make modifications to it or changes. And so that's why for my case, I prefer reactive because it does allow you to do things like, let me go here. State reactive, first name, current count, right? And so here, people can refer to it exactly as they would expect, this dot first name, this dot current count. And it's very natural for people to use. In terms of how Swerve is using and why it's primitive is because basically the ref is what reactive is based on. And so the way I'll show you that is that one of the things about state, right, when we say state reactive, is you'll notice that inside of the template, we have to prefix everything with state, right? And it's now state.firstName, state.current count. And as we know, if with reactive things, gosh, this is going to get rather repetitive over time and it'll pollute our template. So we have a helper method called toRefs here, which allows you to destructure the state into its core pieces. And so what I'm saying here is that what reactive is actually doing underneath the hood is turning all of our properties here into refs. And the fact that I had to explain this is part of the reason, which goes to show, as I tried to mention, is that Composition API does have a new learning, like basically hurdle for people. For those who aren't used to JavaScript and who aren't used to thinking of things this way, which is why I still think the Object API is still not only incredibly valid, but still very useful for a lot of teams. So hopefully that helps to explain what, so that's why you'll see, so basically my TLDR on this, which is too long, didn't read, is that ref, you'll see that some library offers using ref for the primitives, but honestly, my opinion of it is even if you're writing a library, just use reactive and let people access things normally as much as humanly possible. Because otherwise you get into this weird, like you have to run into, like you have to navigate this whole, is it a ref? Do I have to unpack it? And when do I unpack it? So my default when I do Composition API is to only use reactive. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tim Backham has a question. What is the API feature / part you like least about Vue? And if you could force push to master once, what would you change?
Oh man, looking for the spice.
Hope your colleagues don't look at this video.
All right, I'm gonna need to think. Okay, I should have known someone. All right, Tim, let me think about it. Okay, I like least about Vue. Gosh, at this point, it might be actually the thing I just described. Like, unfortunately, I think the complexity with ref versus reactive will continue to probably plague the community a bit. And I would say that when people try to put the options API with the composition API together, I think people will have they're going to try to do things like in the composition API, they'll try to access some reactive things they defined in the options API. And I think that's going to be what we call a foot gun. So basically you accidentally shoot yourself in the foot. Because again, it's a setup lifecycle hook, meaning that all that stuff is going to happen before everything else is created. And I think that's going to take some getting used to for the community. And it would have been nice if we could have had a way to sort of bridge the gap between the two so that we could intelligently sense those things. And for all we know, maybe that's an API enhancement we can do. But for me, I'm all about trying to make things as easy as possible for developers. And so as many foot guns as we can remove, that would be great. So that's my answer for that.
Learned a new phrase, foot gun. Good to know. Awesome. Thanks. Arat has a question. what do you think about the state management in Vue 3? Do we really need to use Vuex4 or reactivity property already enough? Did you try another state management for Vue?
I got it. Great question. So state management is a tricky thing, right? And something that we as developers are very often very opinionated about. So I guess for this, I will share a screen a little bit because just to give people some context. The reason this is becoming more of a discussion right now is because inside of our setup method, so once again, let me wipe everything. Inside of our setup method, what we actually can do is we can call it import use store from, sorry, let me do something. Import global store from like utilities.store.js. Actually, I can. That's fine. I will do it like this. No, I will do it like this. Equals global store. One of the things that the composition API allows you to do is because setup method. Oh, wait, why am I saying import? Wow, const. Is that you can actually start to import partials across components in a very easy way. And this enables us, if you can imagine, if our global store had a reactive data property in there that we shared on multiple components, we can we basically have a store that can be updated and then shared across components. And so the big kind of debate, which I really wish it wasn't, is that, okay, now that we have this, we don't need Vuex anymore, right? And so for those who are from React, Vuex is our global state management, which is closer to, I think, Redux. So we have the state action getter mutation pattern. And my answer to that is actually that Vuex is still actually really valuable as a state management system. And the reason for that is because while it's really great that we can now compartmentalize reactive state and share it and sort of call it like micro stores, one of the things that standards brings to us is that it enforces consistency. And this is particularly important across enterprise. Like when you have teams that scale across different time zones and different abilities, it's nice to be able to go, by the way, this is the definitive way in which we manage store across the entire application. And people can read documentation on it, and there are patterns to follow. And this is great. This is actually really good for scaling. However, of course, if you're looking for flexibility, I think this is what composition API brings in, because now, right, in the past, everyone would stuff everything in the global store because they were trying to share things. Now you can be a little bit more selective in that if a data property is only shared across two components, maybe it really doesn't need to live in Vuex. The other thing about standardized solutions like Vuex that it provides you is really good debugging tools. And so for those of us who have had the joy of trying to debug something from production, is being able to time travel through state changes is really important to figuring out what went wrong. And if you start to get into sort of this free form, like, we can share everything and there's nothing tracking it, like when something goes wrong or there's a side effect and you can't track it, I assure you, you will miss the standard debugging tools. And so don't get me wrong, I think there will be other tools coming out to help manage these things, but standards can really help at scale. And so your final question was regarding other state management tools. And so Pinia is the other one that's actually being basically explored by Eduardo, who actually helps to maintain the Vue router project. And so if you're looking for, I'll drop this in the chat so that people can have that chat. Zoom, boom. Pinia is another state management that actually it looks honestly very promising as far as its ability to be very lightweight and those things. And so know that really as a community, we're looking to keep improving. And I love seeing diversity in thought because it allows us to solve different problems with better tools. And so my final pitch to you about Vuex is that Vuex 5 is in progress, because one of the biggest criticisms of Vuex and like the Redux pattern in general is it's super, like there's a lot of boilerplate. You have to define an action to do a mutation, and it's just like, oh, that's a lot. We're actually trying to get to the point where we can actually, you no longer need to write mutations. We basically just define your action and it'll take care of everything else for you. So we are always looking for ways to improve those experiences. So know that Vuex 5 should be coming with some pretty great developer experience improvements.
Awesome. I think Redux Toolkit did similar, trying to remove all this boilerplate, which we hate to rewrite. Coders don't like to rewrite the same thing again and again.
Yep.
Cool. Alireza has a question. We all know that Vue uses virtual DOM, I guess, a lot of performance improvements implemented in version 3. But still, is there any plan to implement concurrent mode async rendering mode in Vue?
Yeah, so if I understand this correctly, you're asking about the suspense. Well, the suspense component might be your. I'm trying to figure out where the Zoom chat is because it disappeared. Here we go. Here's an article from Vue School, which is another resource in the community. So yeah, basically the question is yes, we are looking at those things so that you can like basically asynchronously bring those things in. I believe that's what you're referring to with concurrent mode async. So suspense technically is an experimental phrase. So I believe if you're using Vue 3 already, you actually can play with it, but just know that it's an experimental API and it could change. So I wouldn't rely on it for production or anything, but certainly for experimentation and playing around with, it is there for you. And then also, if this is important and you don't think it's being covered in the right way, like again, we love hearing from the community and having those sort of discussions back and forth. So, submit an RFC and start talking with us. So,
Awesome. Um, do you recommend people moving to Vue 3? I guess you do, but do you,
no, caveat, always a
no.
caveat.
Okay. Yeah, why, if not?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, um, the general rule of thumb at this point is if you're starting a brand new project and you're looking for TypeScript support and you don't need to support IE 11, or is it IE 9? I believe it's IE 11 actually. If you're looking for Internet Explorer support, basically, don't go to Vue 3 yet. That's like probably your biggest thing. So if you have clients that require it, don't rush. New project, evergreen browsers, great. Go to the Vue 3 route. TypeScript support is, I didn't even mention this, but Vue 3 is completely rewritten with TypeScript. So its experience compared to Vue 2, for those who have heard that Vue 2's experience with TypeScript wasn't as great, completely game changer in Vue 3. So it is now a first class citizen. Um, and so that is the big caveat. But the other thing too is that I know a lot of us are always itching to do the latest and greatest. And so if you have a Vue 2 app, you're like, I really want like the Vue 3 things. But what I want you to know is that for the most part, we're trying to make features as backwards compatible as possible. So for example, I think someone had mentioned earlier, but like the composition API plugin, that's a way for you to use composition API techniques in Vue 2 apps. Granted, you're not going to have like the level of like it's not using JavaScript proxies and those sort of things. So you'll have to still use some like the view.set, like those things to update objects and those sort of things. But again, those are compromises to like minor compromises compared to the fact that you can still use a lot of what makes Vue 3 great. Because on top of that, what I can say is that we are looking at another. It might even be the final one, minor release to Vue 2, which is currently at 2.6. And so for 2.7, we're basically looking to backport as much as humanly possible from 3 into 2.7. So once again, because some apps really, it's not necessarily worth an entire rewrite, but you might want, as you're maintaining it, you might want some enhancements. And so for that reason, we really want to be considerate to those companies who still want the goodies that come with Vue 3, but just in a Vue 2 package. So that is something actively being worked on right now for migration. And yeah, and so the migration to helper also is coming. I know it's taking a little bit longer than we expected, but we're trying to look at ways to better help people migrate from Vue 2 to Vue 3. So think of it like a script that you run against your code base. It'll tell you like things that have been deprecated, things that need to be changed. And even better, an idea that we're trying to figure out. Thanks for coming, Albert. Is that like we're trying to, again, this is can't promise that this will work, but we're trying to look at like possibly allowing you to live in a Vue 2 Vue 3 hybrid mode where some components can actually still use Vue 2 functionality because you're not ready to upgrade. This is particularly a big deal for enterprise companies who can't afford to, again, stop everything and then like move everything over. And so these ideas are being talked about, which I think is super exciting because I mean, bridging that gap I think is really cool. So
Yeah, I think I give the tools back in version 2. Um, um, Dan Plaza has a question. Would you recommend using Nuxt for a new project if SSR is an important requirement and the only reason to
mm,
use Nuxt? Are there other alternatives as easy to use to implement SSR?
yeah, great question. So the straightforward question for SSR right now is I would still use Nuxt because it's definitely the beloved child of the Vue community for really providing a great layer on top of Vue for doing all that SSR stuff for you. Um, However, all right, everything has a caveat. I do know that with the addition of the Vite ecosystem, and as I think Evan's been looking more at this stuff, I think we'll see some interesting developments in the community as far as people building new SSR tools that can solve problems that maybe that are different from Nuxt. Because Nuxt I think has been basically like the leader of this space, and I think competition is always helpful in this regard. So the short answer to your question is if you want to use SSR, go with Nuxt. But as keep an eye on the Vite ecosystem. So for example, a great parallel to this is VuePress is built with like standard Webpack and these sort of things. But on the Vite side, there is VitePress. And so you can start to see that like there are definitely thoughts going towards how we can improve build times and the whole development experience as a whole. So keep an eye on that space for SSR things.
Awesome. Um, Thanks, Dan. What is the Vue team going to focus on this year for 2021? Do you have a roadmap of ideas that you want to bring to the table?
Yeah. As far as the team's concerned, since right now, so for those who don't know, Vue 3 was released in November of last year, if I'm not mistaken. And so this means that we're basically in kind of like ecosystem stabilization mode because right now there are people looking to start moving. And so that's why like the migration tool, for example, is a big focus of ours. It's because we want to help people who do want to make that move to do so. And more importantly, a lot of the libraries like Nuxt, Vuetify, they're catching up too. Like Nuxt 3 should be coming out later this year, as well as like Vuetify 3. And so as the ecosystem is stabilizing, I actually think in terms of open source contributions, this is actually a really great time to get involved because everything's still kind of up in the air a little bit in that like just like Eduardo built Pinia as like an experimental state management library, like this is the time to introduce new ideas and test it with the community because we are in very much an experimental phase. And so you'll also see that with development tooling such as like Viter, Volar, and I think there's a VueDX, for example. Like people are experimenting with how to make the VS Code experience even better, so we can do more auto detection, auto completion without like more configuration from your side. So just know that this is a really exciting time to get involved if that's something you'd like to do.
Awesome. Um, in relation to Angular and React, how what would you say would be Vue's kind of saving grace over those two, or is it a different tool for a different web application?
Yeah, I think Vue saving grace at the end of the day is its flexibility in letting you choose what's best for your team, while providing abstractions, the things that because I know, again, I'm speaking from personal experience. Like one of the hardest things I found when working with React was that people were debating really a lot about like which was the best thing to use. And if you're new to the space, that's actually really overwhelming because unless you decide to hitch your wagon to like a particular thought leader, you're just like I don't know which one to go with. And so Vue providing official recommendations for comment, like again, routing, state management. These are the official ones. You're more than welcome to go outside of it. For example, if you use GraphQL, Vuex doesn't make sense. Use Apollo. Like we encourage you towards those things. I think that is its saving grace because we're not bound to a business like there's no business funding us that's saying please do it this way so that we can leverage it this way and we can therefore make better decisions for the community that like are more representative, I think, of what people need. And I think that's probably one of its biggest advantages.
Awesome. Are there any more questions or no, I think I have a question though.
Yes,
How,
please.
um, how does the Vue core team actually collaborate on all these things? You said they're spread all over. Could you
Yeah.
give a little insight how it is being in one of those teams and how do you all work together on this framework?
Yeah, absolutely. So the tricky part, as you all might imagine, is that because we're spread across different time zones and we're not working for Vue, this means our hours are very very different. So what we have done actually recently, we've been doing this maybe close to a year now, is we meet every other week, basically around like on my time it's like in the morning, so that we try to give, because since most of people are in Europe and Asia, this gives them a chance to join. Um, and so we'll have a team sync where we try to manage all of our updates in Notion. That's what we're currently using. But basically, we collaborate in a document, and people who can't make it but want to provide updates simply update the documents, and they don't show up to the meeting. So it allows a little bit of asynchronous updates. And then the other thing we've also done too is that, as some of you may have felt, like it's tricky with the quarantine that you can't see anyone, because while we're all spread out, we used to actually see each other quite often throughout the year with like traveling to conferences and speaking at things and trying to get together. But unfortunately, that is not available to us right now. So we've started doing like a co-working session, and I highly recommend this. It's not even just for open source, like just set aside like an hour or two on a calendar like every week, and just have like an open Zoom call and just have people come hang out. And then, if you and your friends have similar tastes, we sometimes, I don't know if you know, but Zoom lets you share just the music. So people just like, and everyone's listening to the same thing. And there's a little bit more of a camaraderie with that. And then otherwise, yeah, everything's asynchronous as far as like GitHub issues and, hey, can you check my PR real quick? I have a question. Let's hop on a Discord call to talk about things. And that's kind of how we work as a team.
Sounds cool. Yeah, one final question for me at least. How does
Yeah,
the
please.
composition API compare to React hooks? Are there differences you should know?
Yeah. So React Hook certainly was a big advance in the React ecosystem, right? Because at least from from the basic understandings I have of it, we have when you're declaring like a reactive piece, you have to have like a use state versus and then just like regular state, and you have to destructure that every time. The difference is that the composition API sort of, I would say, almost like takes React Hooks one step further in simplifying that abstraction, in that it detects when you're trying to make a change and when you just want to use it. So now you no longer have to split the difference between the two. And things like having to, like, I know one of the discussions happening is that like use effect is causing some confusion, because like some people were used to lifecycle hooks, and like there's just like how to use that well and keep those things like talking to one another with context and those things. There are a lot of kind of balls in the air at once. And what I think the thing about the composition API, which I think why, like, I hope as React developers try it and maybe even bring it back, is that it actually tries to be as declarative as possible about where things are, so that you're not having to juggle multiple things in your head of where things are coming from. So as I showed earlier with composition API, you can import directly from different modules within a single component, and you'll know exactly where they're coming from, and then you'll use them. Whereas like I've worked on some projects recently where sometimes I realize there's some magic because there's a context being wrapped somewhere else that I didn't know about that's providing said data, and the only way to know that was to like basically do a command find and go backwards. Um, and so I think that's I would say composition API simplifies React hooks based on like my usage of it. And so, like I said, I'd love us to learn from one another and those sort of things. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah,
I think we're running out of time, so and I don't think there's any questions to quickly push in. No. Um,
great.
so yeah, at first, thank you so much for your explanations and your talk, Ben. Is
Yeah,
there
thanks for
anything you would
having
like
me.
to plug before we leave? Maybe someone, I know you've plugged already Jamstack, but nothing. No.
Just wishing all of you the best for things. I know it's a challenging time, and again, like hope we have a chance to all meet in person at some point. And yeah, just wishing everyone well.
Well, awesome. Thank you very much. And
Yeah,
to you all who've been watching, please tell your friends how wonderful this talk was, and how you have to push people into the next talk we have every month, third Thursday
sounds
of the
great.
month. All right. Well,
Thanks everyone for coming. Appreciate
thanks a
it.
lot. See you guys at the next one. Bye bye.
All right, bye bye.